Welcome to the Duck Dive. Today, we're really getting into Joyce Carol Oates' The Faith of a Writer.
Yeah, it's a great collection. Not just biography, but her thoughts on the whole writing life.
Exactly. The process, influences, all that stuff. Our mission, really, is to pull out those key insights about being a writer.
Insights that hopefully resonate with you, give you that deeper understanding without, getting bogged down in overly academic talk.
Right. Distilled wisdom, basically.
So right off the bat, what's striking is how Oates tackles writing itself. She calls it the most solitary art.
This deep withdrawal, right? To build what she calls a counter-world.
Mm-hmm. But then there's the paradox. This totally private act is aimed at connection, at becoming this shared thing for writers and readers.
That tension. Solitude versus community, it seems central.
Absolutely. That's a core insight right there. The personal act aiming for the universal.
Okay, this counter-world idea, she even brings in Freud.
Uh-huh. The point about beauty not having an obvious use.
Yeah, no clear cultural necessity, Freud says, but civilization can't do without it.
So Oates is suggesting through Freud that writing fills this fundamental human need, right? For beauty, for meaning.
Yeah.
Even if it doesn't, pave roads.
It enriches our understanding, creates something valuable.
Exactly. And she talks about the sheer wonder of how that happens, how a single voice started in isolation can become communal.
Or how something really specific to a place can end up feeling universal, sometimes even way after the writer's gone.
It really shows the power of art to connect us across time and space, doesn't it? Through these shared experiences in words.
Then she takes us way back. District school, #7, one room, rural New York.
Oh, the descriptions are amazing. You can almost smell it.
The lack of plumbing, the varnish, the wood, it feels ancient now.
And what's key is how those sensory details shaped her imagination so early on.
Even the dictionary, a treasure of secrets, she calls it, that sparks something.
Yeah, and before she could even properly read, she was making these little books, drawing chickens and cats. Her first novel, The Cat House, so that impulse to tell stories was there from the absolute beginning, before the words, almost.
Definitely. It wasn't just about learning to read, it was about creating narratives.
And speaking of reading, her early encounters sound pretty unsupervised.
Yeah, finding Poe on her own. And thinking kids' books were a bit simple-minded.
Like she was already looking for something heavier, more real.
It seems like it. And that distinction she saw between kids' books and adult lit is really revealing.
She liked the first-person voice in Thoreau, Emerson.
Mm-hmm.
Felt like truth-telling.
Right. More direct than the third-person common in children's stories.
Except
Alice in Wonderland.
the big exception. For her, that book was huge.
Not just a story, but like falling in love with the idea of a book, the object itself.
And she totally identified with Alice. Her curiosity, how calm she stayed in all that weirdness. She apparently memorized huge chunks of it.
Wow. But it wasn't all just fun and games, was it? Her analysis of that mouse poem.
Fury said to a mouse. Yeah, she points out how experimental it is, and kind of cruel, actually.
Subversive, even for a kid's book. Themes of injustice, death, hidden in plain sight.
It suggests even light stuff can have these darker, unsettling layers, which clearly resonated with Oates.
So Lewis Carroll gave her playfulness, but also maybe a touch of morbidity. That mix seems important for her later work.
Absolutely. It shows how complex themes can be explored even in unexpected places, shaping her view of storytelling's power.
Okay, moving on. She gives some very direct advice to young writers.
And it's not the usual write every day stuff, though that might be in there too.
No, she really hammers home focusing on internal drives. Forbidden passions, she calls them. That's the fuel.
Yeah, look inward. Engage with the messy, uncomfortable stuff. Don't just chase trends or approval.
That's the core insight, isn't it? Prioritize your own exploration over what you think people want.
And her advice, to read like crazy without apologizing for your tastes, especially early works of writers you admire.
It's not about copying, right? It's about seeing the journey, how they found their voice.
Exactly. Understanding the process, the struggle.
I liked her point about writing for now, not for posterity. That feels freeing.
Mm-hmm. And the practical tip about maybe using a pseudonym to get past inhibitions.
Yeah, that's actually quite useful. It reminds you to focus on the work itself, your real perspective, not future judgment.
And her warning not to expect fairness from the world,
Yeah.
that art is often recognized later.
It shifts the focus back to the doing it, the process itself, not chasing fame.
And adore other people's art. Learn from it.
Yeah.
That humility, that openness, crucial for growth.
Okay, then there's this really interesting link she makes. Running and writing.
Seems totally different on the surface, right? Physical versus mental.
But for her, they're deeply connected. Running is joyful, feeds the imagination, like dreaming while awake.
She even pictures herself moving through the landscapes of her novels while she runs.
That's wild. It's not just exercise, it's part of the creative process itself.
Yeah, the physical movement directly linked to her fictional worlds. That feels unique to her perspective.
And she says both are addictive and tied to consciousness.
And how the rhythm of running can spark memories or give her space to mentally proofread.
Like the body and mind are working together silently.
And her writing process, that constant revision, looping back.
That's like the rhythm of running, maybe. That iterative refinement.
Could be. And she finds a sense of control, even sanity in both, which underlines how deep that connection runs for her.
So changing gears a bit, she talks about the mystery of human personality, that being a huge driver for her work.
This deep curiosity about what makes people tick, our inner lives, motivations.
It's the core of storytelling, really. Why do people do what they do?
And her point that the artist is sort of subordinate to discovery, that art isn't just chosen, it kind of pre-exists and needs uncovering.
That's a heavy thought. The creative impulse isn't always fully in our control.
And she goes back to Alice again, but looks at Tenniel's illustrations this time, how they capture that dream state.
Where ordinary things get weirdly alive, England as a chessboard. Great image.
And her reading of the survival of the fittest theme in Alice.
All the eating and changing shape.
Yeah, connecting it to childhood anxieties, finding these deep layers in fantasy.
And then she brings in the Brontes, creating Gondel and Angria as kids.
Showing how that sustained imaginative play, those counterfactual worlds, can turn into real art.
It's fascinating, too, how she touches on Updike's early thing for symbols, pop culture.
Or how surrealism and old legends and fairy tales came before realism.
It all points to this fundamental human need for stories, even the really weird ones.
Definitely. And it shows how the seeds for later work are often planted in those early, seemingly random fascinations.
Okay, then we hit a big one. Failure, a topic lots of creative people will grapple with.
And her take is really nuanced. It's not just fear, but this constant sense of mortality hanging over the work.
Like this could be the last one, or the one that just doesn't land right. That posthumous work people pity.
And she describes the writer's inner state as this curious melange of negativity, indecision, frustration, pain. It feels brutally honest.
Yeah, very relatable. And the idea that success feels temporary, but failure feels solid, more substantial somehow.
That rings true. And she gives examples. Faulkner, Henry James, others who had big perceived failures elsewhere.
Failures that actually pushed them towards their greatest work, like failure as a catalyst.
And that distinction she makes between failure as an outcome and failing as the process.
The struggle, the frustration, maybe even the delusion involved in the struggle itself.
That feels more potent, maybe. And she quotes Dickinson, the brain derailed by a splinter. It's a vivid image for how fragile creativity can be.
Then she asks this really provocative thing, are artists secretly in love with failure?
Or maybe just addicted to the risk, the incompletion, the striving.
Knowing that a real work needs its own voice, even if that means it might not succeed conventionally.
And that wild quote, via Dorian Gray, about creating alternative worlds being life's true aim, it loops back to her counterworld idea.
Right. And her point about having to become the person who can write the fiction before you write it.
Leading to this addiction to insomnia, this feeling that things are always about to fall apart. It's a strange paradox.
The examples are so good here. Henry James bombing with his play Guy Domville.
And then writing his masterpieces. Or Alice James, his sister, finding triumph in her diary after a life of perceived failures.
It really reframes success, doesn't it? That idea in their family that an interesting failure was better than obvious success.
Wow. And Connolly wrestling with Palinurus, the will to failure symbol, but ultimately choosing creativity.
It shows that grappling with failure can lead to growth. And Joyce rewriting Stephen Hero into Portrait.
Or Lawrence's early struggles. She mentions the inflexibility needed for genius sometimes.
It all suggests the path isn't smooth. You need resilience, that inner compass, because external measures are unreliable, especially when you're trying something new. The genius can't know they're a genius while they're in the thick of it.
So true. Navigating by internal conviction amidst all the doubt.
Then comes inspiration with the exclamation point, like it's this magic lightning strike.
But her take is actually pretty down to earth, surprisingly.
She starts by saying again that success is distant, failure is the constant companion, and maybe even a motivator.
Yeah, weirdly. And she stresses the physical side of the writing impulse. It's not just mental.
Then she dives into all these amazing examples of where inspiration came from for different writers.
And there's James overhearing gossip, Yeats turning anger into poetry, Isak Dinesen weaving her own illness into her stories.
Sartre seeing tree roots after taking mescaline and it shaping La Nausée. Randall Jarrell getting letters that sparked a poem.
Eudora Welty in a beauty parlor. Eel Doctorow seeing a road sign, Loon Lake. It's often these random, everyday things.
But sometimes it's more deliberate, right? Updike wanting to write the opposite of a typical first novel.
Or Norman Mailer carefully planning his.
Wow.
And John Hawkes getting unstuck by hearing a simple anecdote.
I love that Breton quote. The fantastic does not exist. Everything is real. Blurs those lines.
And Steve Didalis's idea, the epiphany, those sudden flashes of insight, the artist's job is to catch them.
And the voice of a novel being like this hypnotic key captures that mysterious element.
Or the idea of demonic arch, something taking you over, like falling in love or having a brainstorm. Not entirely you.
Nabokov. All poetry is positional, trying to state your place in the universe through language.
And that experience only feels real once it's written down, transcribed.
Virginia Woolf seems key here. Her detailed notes on her own process.
The pleasure in language itself, how ideas emerged organically, like a character's background slowly becoming the rainbow.
And Lauren seeing characters fall into a rhythmic form, not following a strict plan.
It highlights the imprecision, as Oates calls it, that mix of inner stuff and outer triggers.
And Woolf again. The only exciting life is the imaginary one. Back to the counter world.
Yeah, it all circles back. Writing comes from deep within the imagination. It's unique, mysterious, like Dickinson or Kafka, totally lost in their own worlds when inspiration hit.
It really underlines that while we can study craft, the spark itself is personal, maybe even unknowable.
Which leads perfectly into the next bit. Reading as a writer. The artist as craftsman.
Because inspiration isn't enough, right? Oates makes that clear. Fiction writing is a craft you have to learn.
And the main way you learn. Reading. Deeply,
Right.
carefully.
She talks about influence. Obvious ones like O'Connor owing a debt to Nathaniel West or Melville loving Hawthorne.
Or Hemingway changing everything but building on Twain and Sherwood Anderson. These connections are vital.
And sometimes influence is way subtler. Not style, but sensibility.
Like Chekhov and James affecting O'Connor. Or Faulkner on Ellison. Chekhov and Welty again.
Even Homer and the Upanishads on Thoreau. Or Dostoevsky on Richard Wright. These hidden threads.
And Henry James being fascinated by how Sarah Orne Jewett made tiny subjects so powerful. His notebooks are gold for young writers, she says.
Then the examples of writers actively learning by reading. Plath taking apart O'Connor's stories.
Updike soaking up everything, using vernacular. John Gardner typing out other people's books just to feel the rhythm.
Wow, that's dedication. It shows reading isn't passive for a writer.
Not at all. Then she throws in some challenging stuff like D.H. Lawrence's views on Hawthorne and women.
Right, reading involves wrestling with difficult ideas too.
And Fitzgerald's reading list for his Donner books he wanted to be like. Carver, aiming for that subtle prose he admired in others.
John Sayles saying just the existence of other writers is influential. Cynthia Ozick talking about moral influence.
It all comes down to read. Widely, with passion, follow your gut. If you want to write, you have to read. It's that simple.
That Oscar Wilde quote is perfect. Art makes us pause and look again. Reading does that for writers.
You're analyzing every choice. Why this word? Why this structure? Is it working? What can I learn?
It's active analysis. You're constantly asking, is this significant, original, convincing?
That James line again. The artist is one upon whom nothing is lost. Reading sharpens that attention.
And her analyses of Chekhov's Lady with the Dog and Hemingway's Hills Like White Elephants are brilliant illustrations.
Chekhov's seemingly effortless style, the subtle metaphors, that intelligent voice.
Contrasted with Hemingway's minimalism. Barely anything said, but huge tension, that unspoken dread about the abortion. So powerful.
It shows there's no single right way. Mastery is about making the right choices for that story.
Which brings us to self-criticism. The enigmatic art, she calls it.
And yes, she says up front,
Yeah.
having a reliable opinion on your own work, really, really hard.
Writers are often terrible judges of their own stuff. She gives examples. Hardy dismissing his novels, Camus feeling uneasy after the Nobel.
Vidal distrusting praise, Melville thinking Pierre was great, Faulkner preferring a fable. Joyce on Finnegan's Wake,
It's kind of comforting in a way. Even the greats didn't always know.
and Virginia Woolf's constant insecurity, despite her success. Plus, all the revising, Auden, Yeats, James,
Yeah.
Dickinson's endless drafts.
It shows that struggle for perfection, that difficulty in ever feeling done.
But then there's the other side. The ego. O'Connor's confidence. Frost being prickly about other poets. Yevtushenko's huge ego. Nabokov's superiority complex.
It's this weird mix, isn't it? Deep insecurity and massive self-belief, often in the same person.
And that Ibsen idea, the life lie. Maybe some writers need that delusion of genius to keep going.
A protective shield against all the uncertainty. Fascinating idea.
Okay, final sections. We get a peek into the writer's studio.
Her own sounds lovely. Glass walls, looking out at nature, a space for writing and just looking.
That nature connection seems vital for her. And the story about Emily Dickinson using her bedroom.
With that note pinned up, anything that happens to me as a writer has been precipitated by an action of my own, taking responsibility.
Wow, and Oates' view of serious art as transgressive, unsettling, not just comforting.
Pushing boundaries, which ties into her asking, why write so much, acknowledging the maybe obsessive drive.
In describing writing as remembering sensory, cinematic, not just words, that feels very true to her style.
Her habit of completely rewriting finished work because new ideas hit. That relentless drive again.
And needing to know the ending, at least subconsciously, to get the beginning right.
Love the image of her study as a place to bring back daydreams, scraps of paper, like Dickinson.
And that final image of the fawn looking in. What is she doing? Puts it all in perspective.
Then there's the interview about Blonde, starts with that photo of young Norma Jean.
A sense of recognition. Seeing the lost girl before the Maryland product.
And how it grew from a short novella idea into this huge psychological epic, narrated posthumously.
That shows how ideas evolve. And her aim wasn't just biography, but this big, emblematic female portrait like Bovary, but maybe more complex, more admirable even.
The posthumous viewpoint is clever. Gives that sense of inevitability, lets her explore the inner life.
And the fact it was so intense to write she wouldn't want to repeat it tells you a lot.
Her goal was inner, poetic truth, not just facts, which is why she avoided interviews with people like Arthur Miller.
She was creating mythic individuals. The ex-athlete, the playwright, not just historical figures.
And she identified with the playwright character as a conscience figure.
Interesting.
That disconnect she mentions between the private writing process and the public result. Very relatable for artists.
And seeing Norma Jean as universal, beyond gender, with those invented words on her wall, I deserve to live. I needed to justify my life. So powerful.
It really humanizes the myth.
Lastly, that metafictional piece, JCO and I. Exploring the author versus the public persona.
Yeah, like a story acknowledging it's a story. The I versus the JCO. Seeing the books as texts, some remembered, some faded or changed. The author is real. JCO is changeable.
And art as this powerful, maybe uncontrollable force. JCO mining personal history for symbolic, not literal use.
The author as just the door for the writing. Kind of humbling.
And that final line, I, not she, am writing this. A last playful poke at that separation.
It's a clever way to think about authorship and identity. So, looking back at this whole deep dive into the faith of a writer, you really get a sense of the complex forces behind making art.
Absolutely. From childhood sparks to dealing with influence, failure, finding inspiration. It's a whole journey.
And maybe that faith isn't about certainty at all. Maybe it's about sticking with that mysterious process of translating inner worlds into something tangible.
Embracing the exploration, the uncertainty. A journey that, like you said, reveals unexpected things and always leaves you with more questions. Something for you, the listener, to ponder on your own.